With the shift in how we do guided reading to follow the research behind the science of reading, you might be wondering, what does an actual lesson look like? Today I'm going to show you the components of a small group structured literacy lesson and give you examples of each component and an effective routine to follow. But first, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Brenda Tejeda and I've taught for over 17 years, mostly in kindergarten and first grade. And I love sharing my tips and ideas for literacy with you, so make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss my next videos. And today I have a question for you. How comfortable are you with teaching your reading in small groups? Do you always know what you're going to do? Do you have no problem planning your lessons? Or do you sometimes struggle with coming up with the lessons or how to teach them in your groups? Let me know in the comments below. You know, I used to really dread guided reading. When I first started, and we didn't really teach it the way that we do today with a sequential list of phonics skills, teaching it explicitly. It was a lot of guesswork back then, guessing what we really should teach the students, which books to teach it with. I would pull a book and try to find skills in it to teach a certain group. I didn't really have an effective routine, and that made it really hard, really frustrating, really challenging. So I want to share with you an effective routine that you can follow with your students, that it's going to follow phonics in a sequential and explicit way, and it's going to make your small group reading so much easier. If you haven't watched my previous video on exactly what I teach the very first small group reading session, I'll link that above so you can watch that. And in today's video, I am going to assume that you've already taught routines and expectations, you've grouped your students homogeneously so that you have groups with similar needs. Let's get started with the components of your lesson. Here's an overview, and then I'll go over each in detail. Okay, first we're going to start with rereading our previously read texts. We go into a review of previously learned skills, a quick phonological awareness activity, teaching the new focus skill, and then applying it with decoding and reading texts, followed by comprehension, and finally some encoding or writing to apply the skill that we've just learned. Now, it's important to note that you may not get to all of these components every single time that you meet, and that's totally fine. You can spread it over 2 days, which I often did too. It is important though that you go at a quick pace. So you want to make sure that it's fast so your students aren't getting distracted, they're not losing motivation, and your lesson is as effective as it could be. Sometimes you will want to spend more time on writing or more time on the phonics component, on word work. So it's going to depend day by day on what your students need. And we've all had those lessons that we think are going to take a little bit of time, but then they end up taking more time because you realize that your students haven't mastered a previous skill that you have to go over. So you have to kind of pivot and reteach something. It's all about flexibility, so use this as a guide and modify as necessary. Just make sure to hit all the components throughout your week with your students. Now let's go over each one in more depth. Now the first part, rereading, is not part of your formal lesson just yet. If you saw my previous video, I have students come to my reading table with just their reading book baggie, and while they wait for me to get started, because I might be taking notes on the previous group or checking in on my students who are in their centers, they take out their material from their reading book baggie and they practice reading independently. Now, when we get started, I like to start with a quick review of previous skills. So I keep in their group baskets, I have a basket for each group, and I keep the word cards of high frequency words that we've learned before and letter cards. So I'll hold the cards up and we'll do a quick review of the sounds, the letters, and the words that we've covered so far. And I'll take notes to see if I have to reteach any of the skills, and I'll plan that in a future lesson. After reviewing skills, it's time for phonemic awareness. Really quickly, phonemic awareness is just the understanding that words are made up of sounds, the ability to isolate the sounds, blend and segment them. There are a few different phonemic awareness skills that you can teach, but I like to use blending and segmenting the most until later when I introduce phoneme manipulation or sound switching. Do you do that as well? I'd love to know if you focus on blending and segmenting, or if you incorporate all phonemic awareness activities equally. Let me know in the comments below. So for phonemic awareness, I like to use the words that have the phonics skill that we are focusing on that day. And for today, I'm going to use the CH digraph because the free resource that I have for you has the complete lesson on the CH digraph. So I'll be using that as an example throughout this video. I say the sounds in the words and my students will blend them together, or I say the word and my students will segment the sounds to pull the word apart. So for example, I might say ch, a, p. My students say chop. Or I might say chop, and they would say ch-up, chop. In my decodable lesson, as you can see, I have a bank of words already there for you, so you don't have to come up with your own list. And you can actually use the words with your phonemic awareness activity because research has shown that combining the two is actually more effective. So that can look like this. You can say, okay, students, look at that first row of words. I'm going to say the sounds in a word. I want you to blend it in your head and find the word that I mean on your page. Ch, a, p. And they will silently blend it together and find the word. Now it's time to teach your new skill and your focus skill of the day. So you can say, okay, what did all those words have in common? Chop, much, chin, such. They all had what sound? That ch sound. And so that ch sound is represented by the letters CH, which is a digraph. We've already learned about a digraph before. Remember when we learned that SH come together to say sh? Well, CH is another digraph. Independently, the C says k, and the H says h, but when they come together, they make a new sound, which is ch. Now on this teaching card on the back, I have a teacher script that you can read or you can use as a guide. And then this side has the example for you to model with. So you would read the back of the card, explain what a digraph is. You can talk about the articulation. So what is our mouth doing when we make that ch sound? What are our teeth doing? Where is our tongue? What does it look like? You can show them, you can use little mirrors if you'd like. And then you can model reading a word, read one together, and then have them try on their own. It's that I do, we do, you do model. So for example, look at me read this word, ch, I, n, chin. Let's read the next one together. Ch, I, p, chip. Can you try the next one? And so on. So you can use these cards to help you. Of course, you can simply write CH on your whiteboard, but these teaching cards make it a little bit easier for you to have an example at your fingertips to use with your students. Next, we go into decoding, or where you apply your skills in reading words that have that phonics skill. So you can use words, you can use sentences, you can use books or passages. The important thing is to give your students many opportunities to practice that skill when reading text. And one way to do this is to use decodable text. And when I say decodable, I mean that you're using text that has words students can decode because they've learned the phonics skills needed to decode that text, whatever text you're using. And before reading the text, I go over any vocabulary, any high frequency words, or any words that are not decodable, and we review those words before we read the text. In my decodable lessons, you'll notice that I have students applying the phonics skill by reading words, then writing words with that phonics skill, reading the word again in phrases to practice fluency, and then we go over some high frequency words that are in the passage, and the passage again is decodable. Any words that I have in my lessons that are not fully decodable are underlined so that you can review that word before having your students read the text. In your freebie, I go over an effective structured routine for teaching high frequency words to your students. Let me know if you want a video of that and I will make one and link it up here. In addition to the passages that I have in my decodable lessons, I have these books that are also decodable. They have similar stories, but they're different than the ones in the lessons. So I will add this one actually in your free download so that you have it to use. So you can go over the preview page with your students, isolating that grapheme or the letters that represent that ch sound, read the decodable words together and the high frequency words that are in the story. And then I like to read the first page together with my students and then have them read the remaining pages as I listen in on them. These books also have a little comprehension check at the end where there are sentences and students fill in the missing word to show that they have understood and they have good comprehension of the text. After reading, of course, you're going to want to make sure that your students are understanding what they read, so we move on to comprehension. And one thing I noticed that students really have a hard time with is summarizing. So we practice a lot of retelling in our classroom. We practice a lot of summarizing because sometimes they really can't tell the difference. Instead of telling me every single thing that happened in a story, I teach them and I model what summarizing is. So after every text that we read, I practice summarizing. I'll model for them and have them summarize the story. Then of course, to make sure that they understand, I will ask them specific questions about the text and have them go back to the text to find the evidence, which is an important skill that will help them later on. Now I know that in beginner text, it can be hard to find questions that require a higher level thinking, like making inferences. So in some of my lessons, I also included a thinking bubble with a specific question that you can ask your students and have a little discussion in your small group. So for example, in this CK lesson, I'll read the quick story to you. Buck is a duck. Buck likes to go out on the dock. He pecks at a rock. The rock moves. Quack, shouts Buck. It is not a rock. It is a turtle. I have a comprehension question, but then I also include a little speech bubble that asks, think about it. Why do you think Buck thought the turtle was a rock? And here students can infer and they can compare the rock to a turtle, and it can just lead into a deeper level of comprehension discussion with your group. So far, we've reviewed previously learned skills, we've done a phonemic awareness activity, we've learned a new phonics skill or sound for the day, and we have applied that with decoding. Now it's time to apply it with encoding or spelling and writing. So that can look different ways. You can use magnetic letters to build words, which we often do, and you can also have students do writing. I like to have my students write a few words with the target skill, and then I like to do a sentence dictation. And here are some tips for a sentence dictation. So let's take this lesson, for example, about Chad and Rich, and your sentence might be Chad and Rich chop some logs. You want to make sure that your students repeat the sentence that you're dictating several times. We like to use different voices, so I might say, okay, echo me, Chad and Rich chop some logs. Chad and Rich chop some logs. Now let's do it in a whisper voice. Chad and Rich. Now a monster voice. Chad and Rich. So you want to do it plenty of times so they can remember the entire sentence. And if they're having a hard time remembering the entire sentence, you want to shorten that sentence and build up to those longer sentences. So let's use the sentence, Chad and Rich chop some logs. So you're going to count the words after they repeat it a few times. Count the words, Chad and Rich chop some logs. If you have students who need extra support, you can write the lines for them. Chad and Rich chop some logs. And then you're going to ask them to write the entire sentence. Now, as they're writing, you want to provide them immediate feedback. So if you notice that they're writing, let's say the word rich, which is a name, with a lowercase r, you want to say, okay, that's a name. What do we start our names with? Make sure it's a capital letter. And as they're writing their sentence, you want to guide them. But you don't want to provide them the sentence word by word. So if they get to write Chad and Rich, but they forgot which word comes next, prompt them to reread what they have so far and try to remember the word on their own. Chad and Rich, what did they do? Chop. Chad and Rich, have them say the whole sentence again. Chad and Rich chop some logs, pointing to the line so they know exactly what they're going to write to finish a sentence. Now let's say they say Chad and Rich and they cannot remember that next word. Then I would stop and repeat the entire sentence to them, not tell them what the next word is. Because remember, you want them to be able to apply this skill when they're doing their independent writing practice, their independent writing, and if they're relying on you to feed them word by word, it's not going to translate well when they're doing writing on their own. And one of the skills we teach our students when they're writing is to reread as they go in case they have missing words or extra words, just to fix any mistakes as they go. So that's important to also do when you're dictating a sentence. Have them stop and reread everything that they've written so far, and especially when you're done with the sentence, have them point to each word and make sure that they have written everything correctly. Of course, remind them to use a punctuation mark at the end, and now your writing is done. Now, if you're doing your lesson across 2 days, you might still have time to play a game to reinforce some skills, practice those high-frequency sight words, or any other skill that you want to review. When you're done with your lesson, you want to give your students a copy of the text that you used so they can keep in their reading book baggies and practice for fluency during morning time when they first come in, if they finish an activity early, during centers, or of course, when they come to your reading table the next time, they can pull out these texts and practice rereading them. Now let's recap. The entire lesson is going to include rereading when they come to you a familiar text. Then you're going to review the previous lesson and skills that they've learned. Make sure you take notes as you go so that you know if you have to reteach anything. Then you're going to do phonological or phonemic awareness, teach your new skill, and then apply it with decoding, whether it's words, sentences, fluency phrases, and your text. Next, you're going to want to do comprehension, and finally encode or apply it with writing. So there you go. It's a small group reading routine that works and incorporates all the key reading components. I hope this video was helpful to you. Make sure to comment if you're going to try anything or if you have any comments, any questions at all, and hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss my next video. Thank you so much for watching.